Hello students, my name is Emily Poole and I'm here to teach you all about AP European History, Unit 5, Crisis, Conflict, and Reaction in the late 18th century. Now before we begin, as always, click the link in the description below because it will take you to a speed review guide that I've made for you. But I don't want you to do anything with it yet. I'm going to have you circle it and mark it up at the end of the video. Just have it downloaded and ready to go. All right students, is it downloaded? Are you ready to go? Let's talk about AP Euro Unit 5. Starting off with a big picture, here is Unit 5 in 5 sentences. Number 1, Europe is increasingly connected to global trade, and the expansion of European commerce accelerated the growth of a worldwide economic network. Number 2, the 7 Years' War results in the rise of Britain's dominance in Europe, but also results in revolutions in both the North American colonies and France. Number 3, the French Revolution initially results in the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, but then turns radical under Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. Number 4, in the wake of the French Revolution, Napoleon seizes power, rules as emperor, and attempts to conquer most of Europe, which leads to the spread of nationalism across the continent. And number 5, European leaders convene at the Congress of Vienna to reestablish a balance of power by suppressing nationalistic or revolutionary revolts. But how did it all get that way? Let's contextualize. Remember, new political and intellectual theories had been proposed by those Enlightenment philosophers. People like Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu advocated for consent of the governed, freedom of speech, religious toleration, and a separation of powers. And those new political theories fomenting an increasingly wealth-divided Europe, because remember, European commerce and trade was expansive, led to, you guessed it, revolution. Now, before we get into revolution, let me first start off by talking about piracy, because why not? And it's super fun. And maybe this was inspired by the fact that I did just watch all 5 Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Now, the 1600s to the 1700s was the golden age of piracy, and y'all, I am not kidding. Trade was so expansive across the Atlantic, with powers like France, Britain, and Spain dominating that triangular trading system. But don't forget about the Indian Ocean, because the Dutch and the Portuguese were banking within that area of the world, which, due to the spice trade, was mind-bogglingly prosperous. Now, it is because of that wealth in Asia that Britain wanted to get increasingly involved in the Indian Ocean trade, which led to Britain's acquisition of India as a new colony. With that stage set, y'all just think about the amount of wealth that is getting traded over these seas. Literal gold and silver bullion, yes, but also natural resources and coffee and tea and spices. And of course, piracy is going to reign supreme in the 1600s to 1700s. Now, isn't it a way more fun way of saying what the CED wants you to know, which is, and I quote, commercial rivalries influenced diplomacy and warfare among European states in the early modern era, and European sea powers vied for Atlantic influence throughout the 18th century. Come on, history's amazing. Now, by the late 1600s and into the 1700s, conflict in Europe is no longer centered on religious wars or religious differences. Rather, it's centered on power and wealth and influence. Small Portugal and the Dutch Republic are absent from many of these wars, as they are way more focused on controlling trade in the East. And the two superpowers that emerge in Western Europe, at least, are Britain and France. And they differ in a lot of ways. One is Protestant and is a constitutional monarchy, while France is Catholic and is under absolute rule. And conflict between them also exists in their expanding borders as they vie for power and influence and control of trade in North America and the West Indies, aka the Caribbean. Now, as that age-old rivalry continues on, a new rivalry emerges in the East. While those religiously tolerant countries of Prussia, Russia, and Austria did embrace some Enlightenment thought into their rule, they also, like Western Europe and Britain and France, fought each other for power and control and influence. Signed in 1713, the Pragmatic Sanction stated that Habsburg lands were indeed allowed to pass to a woman if Habsburg ruler Charles VI had no male heir. And he did not have a male heir that survived to adulthood, so at his death, Habsburg lands transferred to his daughter, Maria Theresa. Prussian leader Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, ignored that proclamation and seized Silesia, a land rich in people and also natural resources. Now, when this conflict broke out initially, France, always wanting to weaken the Habsburgs, supported Prussia, and Britain, who was way more concerned with the control of a balance of power on the continent of Europe, sided with Austria. But in a wild turn of events after the War of Austrian Succession, an Austrian diplomat named Count von Kaunitz convinced France that it in fact needed to ally with the Habsburgs, not against them. This alliance was solidified when Maria Theresa's daughter, Marie Antoinette, was married off to a young French prince who would later become Louis XVI. Britain, again wanting to make sure that a balance of power is existing in Europe, also then swapped sides and allied with Prussia. And eventually, it is this conflict that kicks off the First World War. No, not World War I, the 7 Years' War. Now, the main sides in the 7 Years' War are Britain and Prussia, and they are fighting against France, Russia, and Austria. And this war plays out on 3 continents because when an imperial power goes to war, its colonies have to as well. In Europe, Frederick II's brilliant military tactics allowed him to hold strong against his foes, but it was mainly Russia's exit from the war under Tsar Peter III that facilitated Prussia's ultimate victory. In the Americas, this war plays out in what is called the French and Indian War, and Britain's defeat of the French gave Britain just like a lot of territory. Britain also gained French territory in the West Indies and in India, and it's this that leads to Britain's ascendancy in power. So to greatly summarize the 7 Years' War, Britain and Prussia defeated France, Russia, and Austria, and the territory that Britain and Prussia kept or gained as a result of their win led to the dominance of both of those nations. And because this was a global war that cost a lot of money, all countries involved are going to need to raise taxes, which leads to, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But this isn't AP US or AP World, this is AP Euro, so I will not wrap the entirety of Hamilton to you. Instead, let's just get straight to the bloody and the gory French Revolution. Look, the French Revolution is a subject that I'm sure your teacher did a phenomenal job talking about in class. It's so fun. The violence, the bloodshed, the guillotine, or Robespierre. If I were to share with you all of my stories and anecdotes and details, this video would be hours long. So instead of doing that, I'm going to tell you just literally what you need to know for the AP test. All right, you got long-term social and political causes and short-term economic causes. Let's break it down. Socially, the Third Estate was having a real rough go. They made up 98% of the population and they paid all the taxes. Meanwhile, the Second and the First Estate, the nobility and the clergy, respectively, were living these large and lavish lives. Y'all, my literal one rule that I tell my students every single year is that, in the event of an apocalypse and the world is destroyed and world structures are recreated and then you inevitably emerge as leader, one rule: keep the lower class on your side. They can do so much. Peasant revolts are the real deal. You gotta keep them on your side. Anyway. Politically, in the 1700s, France had fought a lot of wars under Louis XIV, and early on, those actually served to bolster France's power and influence. But that went away over time, especially after the War of Spanish Succession and definitely after the 7 Years' War. Also, the Third Estate didn't love the monarchy in France. And yes, this was inspired by Voltaire's writings, but also inspired by the fact that the social, political, and economic disparity was enormous in that estate's system. Okay, now this part won't show up on your AP test, but I just need to tell you, did you know that Marie Antoinette had her own hairdresser? Yeah, Monsieur Leonard was known for making extravagant masterpieces on her head. So when you're a Third Estate pleb and you hear that your queen has enough money to literally have a ship constructed within her hair, yeah, you're gonna not like the monarchy. Speaking of that, let's talk about short-term economic causes. Now, the First and the Second Estate didn't pay taxes, which means the entirety of the tax burden was placed on the Third Estate, who were already poor and struggling. Like, Louis, you're gonna help those American colonists fight a war against the British because you care more about weakening the British Empire than you do about, making sure that your people and your nation have enough food to eat? Throw an extra famine into the mix and then have the king raise prices on grains, and yeah, It's a ripe time for a revolution. Now, the French Revolution itself existed in two phases. You have the liberal or moderate phase and then the radical phase. The liberal phase of the French Revolution was quite successful. Inspired by the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, the French National Assembly wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, fearing that the king would not respect the newly drafted declaration, the Poissons, the fish women of France, march on to Versailles and demand that Louis and Marie move to Paris so that they could be monitored. Which I also just love that story because, again, it's women being active agents in European history. They are the ones who march on Versailles. They are the ones who stick the heads on pikes and march back to Paris. They are the ones who imprison Marie and Louis. The National Assembly also passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which seized church lands and nationalized the Catholic Church, which meant that high clergy was elected by people and paid by the state. The Assembly also abolished hereditary nobility privilege. They divided France into districts run by elected officials, and they wrote the Constitution of 1791, which they forced King Louis to sign, which itself actually established France as a constitutional monarchy. Man, they got a lot done between 1789 and 1791, and they were all pretty successful things. But then in August of 1791, Austria and Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, in which they promised that they would seek to restore order in France if they had other external support. And it was this outside opposition to the revolution that inspired the revolutionaries to spread their ideals across Europe through armed force. And it was these revolutionary armies raised by mass conscription that sought to bring the changes initiated in France to the rest of Europe. France then declares war on Austria and Prussia, and then that's what brings France in to the second phase, the radical phase of the revolution. Now, a writer named Jean-Paul Marat said, hey, if the revolution is right, then the king is wrong, and continued to inspire and foment political turmoil through his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, which itself is a great example of mass media inspiring the public to action. The National Assembly declared France a republic in September of 1792, and in January of 1793, they put King Louis XVI on trial for treason. He was beheaded via the guillotine, which is often considered a democratic killing machine, and let me tell you why. Now, historically, beheadings were only reserved for the nobility because it was considered this honorable way to die. If you weren't a noble and you were put on trial for treason, you could die by being drawn and quartered. Ugh. But the guillotine made everyone equal in death and also was used by the people, for the people. So it was democratic, you see. Now, it was this regicide, this death of Louis XVI, that led to the radical phase of the French Revolution. Robespierre, part of the Jacobin faction, helped lead the Committee of Public Safety, a group of 12 men that steered France through its reign of terror. By the way, Committee of Public Safety is not where we get the word cops from, but I really wish that it was. And it was during this reign of terror that tens of thousands of people died. Anyone who spoke out against the revolution or were opposed to what was happening in France could have been put on the guillotine block. Now, while that is very bad, Robespierre's leadership also did lead to some positive developments in France. France adopted the use of the metric system, and then Robespierre himself actually passed the laws of general maximum, which set maximum prices for crucial goods like grain. Wanting to remove all facets of the Ancien regime, Jacques-René Hébert, inspired by Voltaire's anti-church rhetoric, pursued a policy of de-Christianization. This resulted in the creation of a new calendar, turned Notre Dame into the Temple of Reason, and started the deistic cult of the Supreme Being. Now, Robespierre himself died via guillotine in 1794 in the month of July, or if you're following the French revolutionary calendar, the month of Thermidor. His death ended the terror, and a 5-man directory stepped in to rule over France, until Napoleon used his power and their weakness and then threw a coup d'etat. Now, the terror is rightfully terrifying to those countries that are observing what's happening in France, especially when you add in the fact that these revolutionaries are trying to inspire similar revolts across the continent of Europe. But the rallying cry of liberty, equality, and brotherhood had the most resounding effect in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was a French colony in the Caribbean that was incredibly profitable for France, as it produced a wealth of sugar and coffee through enslaved labor. These enslaved Haitians got word about what was happening in France, and they thought, liberty, equality, brotherhood, does that also apply to us? It sure did not, and even despite Napoleon sending 20,000 soldiers to squash the Haitian revolutionaries, they were ultimately victorious thanks to leadership by Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Haiti successfully gained its independence in 1804. Okay, let's pause and compare the Haitian and French revolutions. Remember, the AP test doesn't just want you to know the content, they also want you to be able to draw conclusions based on the evidence that you're given, and they want you to know how to use those historical thinking processes, like the skill of comparison. Now, similarly, both revolutions were inspired by Enlightenment ideals like equality and human rights, and both fought against an oppressive government that restricted those rights. But while the Third Estate was fighting for more social equality, political representation, and a lessening of economic burdens in the French Revolution, the enslaved Haitians were fighting for literal social, political, and economic freedom and independence. My hottest take, y'all, and this would be a fun debate to have in your class, is that the Haitian Revolution was politically successful and the French Revolution was not. Controversial, I know. Let's break it down. Yes, the French Revolution was initially successful in that it did establish a constitutional monarchy. The king's power was checked, the power of the church was limited, and Robespierre did resolve some economic crises by fixing prices and wages. But y'all, it then descended into chaos. Y'all, France went from a monarchy to a constitutional monarchy to chaos to an oligarchy to an emperor, and then they just decided to cut their losses and just become a monarchy again. Louis XVI was beheaded. Robespierre, I guess, kind of ruled for a minute, and then a 5-man directory stepped in to rule for 4 years, but they didn't really know what they were doing, and then Napoleon comes in and crowns himself emperor and then tries to conquer Europe, but then is exiled, but then comes back and tries to conquer Europe again, and is finally exiled to St. Helena, where he dies, and France is like, what do we do? And they reestablished the Bourbon monarchy. They went from a monarchy to a constitutional monarchy to chaos to an oligarchy to an emperor, and then decided, well, let's just cut our losses and be a monarchy again. In contrast, the Haitian Revolution was successful in that they established themselves as a new independent nation. They, like the American colonists in the American Revolution or many Latin Americans in their respective revolutions, successfully fought against their colonial power and established a new government that lasted. Anyway, just some food for thought. I keep talking about this guy Napoleon, and I just gotta start out by busting a myth. Napoleon was not short. He was 5'7", and it is hilarious to me that this piece of British propaganda is the one thing that everyone thinks they know about Napoleon, but it is in fact not true. Napoleon threw his coup d'etat against the Directory and ruled as first consul, and then literally crowned himself emperor. Like, yo, he invited the Pope to crown him emperor, but instead, he took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head, essentially symbolizing that he is subservient to no one. What a power move. Now, the real question is, was Napoleon a friend or a foe of the French Revolution? He did support some of the achievements made by the revolutionaries and also instituted his own reforms, like the creation of a meritocracy, requiring education through lycées, and creating a civil code, which became the model for law codes around Europe. But he also curtailed rights. He reinstituted censorship. He removed a lot of the advancements that women had made during the French Revolution, and he reinstituted standing with the Catholic Church, which can be helpful or hurtful depending on how you look at it. Also, y'all, Napoleon loved Rome. Like, he loved Roman history. I mean, he originally ruled as first consul, right? He went to a military school, and during his education, he read those military classics of antiquity, including Plutarch's Lives, of which heroism and patriotism were forefront themes. And picturing himself as Caesar, what did he do? Well, tried to conquer Europe. His impressive military tactics gave him direct or indirect control over most of Europe, which also served to spread the ideals of the French Revolution to the spaces he conquered. And it definitely increased nationalism across Europe. The nations that he conquered did not want to be part of the French Empire, and their response, like in Spain, for example, was to focus on their shared sense of national identity and unite in that nationalism. Now, Napoleon is captured and sent to exile in Elba, which is an island in the Mediterranean. Like, come on, Europe. And you were surprised when he came back to rule for his 100 days? After his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon is exiled a second time, but this time to St. Helena, which is an island off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic, which is a much smarter move and is also where he dies. Organized by Clemens von Metternich, major European powers got together in 1814 to talk about the chaos that just happened. I mean, within a few decades, France had a revolution, it killed its monarchs, and then a guy who wanted to take over all of Europe almost did. These monarchs at the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore that balance of power and uphold traditional conservative values. None of this revolutionary Enlightenment stuff, none of this bourgeois nationalism. They wanted traditional power and social structures and were ready to work to ensure that. Let's talk about political effects of the Congress of Vienna. Yes, borders changed and smaller countries began to ally with their neighbors in order to provide some more defense. But this Congress is an excellent example of European leaders coming together to come to an agreement about how to resolve a problem. And they also found a peaceful solution moving forward. Wow, can you imagine all of these powerful nations coming together to settle on agreeable terms for all without specifically punishing one country? I wonder if that's going to stay the same case in Europe. As always, let's end with art. Ugh, I love the Romantic movement. And you know who else loves the Romantic movement? The College Board. They will ask you essay questions about this. They will ask you SAQ questions about it. It's going to show up on your test. So are you ready to learn about it? Religion says that truth comes from God. The Enlightenment says that truth comes from reason. And the Romantic movement says that truth comes from feeling and emotion. Romanticism emerged as a challenge to this Enlightenment rationality. Rather than logically believing and understanding how things work, Romantics believed that one should rely on emotion and feeling as well. And it was Rousseau himself, that Enlightenment philosopher that we talked about in the last unit, who spearheaded a lot of this Romantic movement. He believed that being in touch with one's emotions was a way to seek moral self-improvement. Now, this reliance on feelings and emotions was concomitant with spiritual and religious revival as well, and a new Protestant denomination called Methodism emerged under John Wesley. Rather than focusing on a theological understanding of doctrine, Methodists focused on assurance of salvation through the power of the Holy Spirit and through the love of God, leading to religious revival in the Americas and in England. And look no further than Romantic art to understand this feeling of intense emotion and nationalism. Now, remember that this art should be a good visual anchor for you, right? It's something for you to think about in your brain when you're thinking about Romanticism. So let's look at some of it. Let's start off with Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Y'all, it is liberty. It is an emotion, an ideal who is leading the people, not reason and not logic. Also, nationalism is very present in this image. Next is Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. The vastness of nature. He looks like he's standing atop a mountain, contemplating his existence and his purpose. That's Romanticism right there. So, to summarize Unit 5, economically, commercial rivalries influenced diplomacy and warfare among European states in the early modern era. Politically, Britain emerged as the dominant power in Western Europe, and Prussia emerged as a dominant power in the East. France's revolution was debatably successful, but led to the rise, dominance, and defeat of Napoleon. In the wake of Napoleon, nationalism grew across Europe, and European leaders convened at the Congress of Vienna in order to restore a balance of power and retain traditional conservative values. And culturally, Romantics respond to the cold, hard logic and reason of the Enlightenment by exploring emotions, which led to a revival of public expression of emotions and feelings. That's it. That's all of Unit 5. So what you need to do right now is go back to that speed review sheet, make sure that you check off the things that you do know, circle or highlight the things that you don't know, and then spend some time thinking about those thematic developments that occurred over the course of this unit. And if you want extra skill practice, make sure you spend some time thinking about how you could answer those comparison or causation questions that I have for you at the very bottom. And make sure that you utilize those extra skills practice sheets that I have for you in the Ultimate Review Packet. As always, you can do it. I believe in you. Until next time, bye.